The room fell silent when Mike Pompeo leaned forward, eyes burning with contempt. He thought he was about to end Jasmine Crockett's career with one brutal attack. His words dripped with confidence, the kind of confidence that comes not from truth, but from years of holding power, of towering over anyone who dared challenge him. He smirked as if the fight was already won. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett sat poised, her eyes steady, her hands still. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. To Pompeo, she looked like easy prey. A first-term congresswoman, a young black woman with a record he thought he could twist into shreds. To him, this was sport. To her, it was survival. Pompeo's voice cut through the air like a blade. He hurled accusations, sharpened with arrogance, wrapped in the false authority of a man used to dominating the stage. His words weren't just an attack on Crockett. They were meant as a warning to anyone who dared to challenge his version of America. Loud, dismissive, built on intimidation. The audience shifted uneasily, sensing the tension. Phones came up to record. This was more than an argument. This was a spectacle. A heavyweight throwing punches at someone he thought couldn't swing back. Pompeo's allies leaned in, grinning, ready to savor the humiliation they believed was seconds away. But Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She absorbed every word, letting him build his own mountain of arrogance higher and higher. Inside the silence of her stillness was something Pompeo never saw coming. Resolve. Because this wasn't just about defending her record, it was about defending every voice he tried to silence, every community he treated as lesser, every young woman told she wasn't enough. Crockett represented more than herself, and in that moment her silence was louder than his insults. Pompeo leaned back, smug, certain that he had delivered the fatal blow. The cameras caught his satisfied grin, the pause before he expected applause. But instead, there was an eerie hush. It was as if the room itself knew something he didn't, because what happened next would leave Mike Pompeo, a man who prided himself on never being outmatched, stunned into silence. And for Jasmine Crockett, this was only the beginning. This was not just another exchange of words. It was more than a clash of political talking points. On this night, in this room, the moment carried weight far heavier than the insults Pompeo thought he could throw without consequence. Because behind the bright lights, the rolling cameras, and the rows of expectant faces, something larger was unfolding. A test of what America's future would look like. For Pompeo, the former Secretary of State, this was familiar ground. He had stood in boardrooms, briefing rooms, and war rooms. He had debated foreign leaders, grilled reporters, and brushed off critics. Years in power had taught him one thing: intimidation works. Speak loudly, press hard, show no cracks. And tonight, he carried that same swagger into his attack on Jasmine Crockett. To him, she was simply another stepping stone, another name to bury under his rehearsed rhetoric. But for Crockett, the stakes were different. She didn't walk into that room with the shield of establishment power or the comfort of elite networks behind her. She walked in carrying the weight of those who had been dismissed, doubted, and silenced. She walked in as a representative of people who had been told their voices were too small, too radical, too unpolished to matter. And in facing Pompeo, she wasn't just defending herself. She was defending them. The audience could feel the imbalance. One side projected the force of a seasoned power broker, dripping with authority and entitlement. The other sat, calm, quiet, underestimated, as if holding something close to her chest. Those who underestimated Crockett mistook her stillness for weakness. They didn't see the steel underneath. They didn't see the years of standing firm in courtrooms, in protests, in a world that had already tried to knock her down countless times. Pompeo pressed harder, layering insult after insult. He treated her record as if it were a list of failures, as if her story could be reduced to sound bites crafted to humiliate. Each word was designed to make her shrink, but she didn't. And in that refusal, the balance of power began to shift. Because in moments like these, history doesn't remember the loudest voice. It remembers the one that refuses to break. Pompeo thought he was scripting a downfall. What he didn't realize was that he was setting the stage for something far greater, a moment of clarity that would not belong to him. The cameras were rolling. Millions were watching. Social media was already buzzing, people waiting for the clip that would define the night. The silence between Pompeo's insults and Crockett's yet-to-come response was electric, charged with possibility. Everyone knew something was about to happen. No one knew how seismic it would be. Pompeo believed his attack was the climax, but in reality it was only the setup. What came next would not only flip the script, it would ripple beyond that room, beyond that night, beyond even the careers of the two people at its center. Little did he know, the reply about to come would echo far beyond these walls. Mike Pompeo did not arrive at this moment by accident. His career had been built on power plays, on forcing his presence into every room, on making others bend before his weight. As a former Secretary of State, his name carried the kind of recognition that comes with global headlines and closed-door negotiations. He had been photographed shaking hands with world leaders, speaking before international assemblies, and addressing America with the certainty of a man who believed his authority was unshakable. That reputation did not come without cost, but Pompeo embraced it. He thrived on being labeled combative, on being seen as someone who could bulldoze his way through opposition. His allies called it strength. His critics called it arrogance. Either way, Pompeo leaned into it, convinced that intimidation was not only effective but essential. He spoke in blunt sentences, often laced with condescension, as though every exchange was a contest he was born to win. Over the years, he had made dismissiveness into an art form. When reporters challenged him, he smirked and brushed off their questions with a joke at their expense. When foreign officials resisted his demands, he doubled down, projecting America's power as his own personal weapon. Even in interviews, he carried himself with the confidence of someone certain that no rebuttal could ever puncture his armor. And for the most part, it worked. Few ever managed to unsettle him. But arrogance, like a shadow, always follows too closely. The more he relied on belittling others, the more predictable his tactics became. His pattern was simple. Strike hard, show no fear, overwhelm with volume and certainty. For years, that pattern left opponents scrambling, unsure how to respond under the weight of his bravado. Pompeo took pride in watching them falter. To him, victory wasn't just about the strength of his argument. It was about the collapse of his opponent's composure. It was this very mindset that framed his attack on Jasmine Crockett. He looked at her and saw what he had seen countless times before. Someone untested, someone vulnerable, someone he believed he could humiliate into silence. He measured her by her relative newness in the political spotlight, by her background outside the establishment power structures he had mastered. He thought her youth, her gender, her identity were weaknesses to exploit. This overconfidence dripped from every word he hurled her way. He had faced senators, diplomats, and foreign ministers. In comparison, he told himself, this would be easy. Another easy takedown, another clip to circulate, another moment to reinforce his image as the hardliner who never lost. His allies, watching closely, believed it too. They leaned back in their chairs, smirks spreading across their faces, anticipating Crockett's collapse. But Pompeo had misread the terrain. What he didn't understand, what his arrogance blinded him from seeing, was that Jasmine Crockett's entire life had been shaped by standing in rooms where she was underestimated. Every insult he thought would break her was, in truth, fuel. Every jab at her record was a spark that only lit her fire brighter. And yet in that moment Pompeo was still convinced of his control. He mistook her composure for submission. He thought silence meant defeat. He thought the stillness in her eyes was a sign that his words had cut deep. What he couldn't see, what no amount of arrogance could allow him to see, was the storm, gathering just beneath the surface. Pompeo saw this as another easy takedown. But this time, he picked the wrong opponent, because Jasmine Crockett wasn't about to back down. Jasmine Crockett's story did not begin in the marble halls of Congress. It began in a modest home, rooted in the working-class grit of a family that taught her the value of persistence. She was not born into privilege, nor was she handed the tools of power. Instead, she had to build her path step by step, facing barriers that were designed to keep voices like hers out of the rooms where decisions are made. As a child, Crockett watched her community struggle against the weight of inequality. She saw neighbors work 2 or 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. She heard stories of families silenced by systems that did not care for them. These experiences were not abstract lessons. They were the reality she lived in. And instead of turning away, she let those struggles shape her resolve. Education became her weapon. But even that path was not easy. The classroom she sat in often overlooked students like her, assuming they would not rise beyond the margins. Yet Crockett refused to be overlooked. She pushed herself forward, refusing to let others define her ceiling. She carried the dreams of her parents and her community into every late-night study session, every exam, every challenge. Her decision to pursue law was not born out of ambition for wealth or status. It was born out of anger at injustice. She wanted the skills to fight back, to stand up for those who were told they had no voice. As a lawyer, she defended the vulnerable, standing in courtrooms where the odds were stacked against her clients. She became the shield for people who had nowhere else to turn. But Crockett was not satisfied with simply practicing law. She understood that the system itself needed change, not just defense. Activism became her second language. She marched, she organized, she spoke out when silence was safer. For her, politics was never about ambition. It was about duty. Each rally she attended, each case she fought, each barrier she crossed carved her into a leader defined not by privilege but by persistence. Her path to Congress was paved with resistance. Opponents underestimated her, donors dismissed her, commentators doubted her. She was too new, too bold, too unwilling to play by the old rules. But every no only sharpened her resolve. And when she finally stepped into the halls of power, it was not as someone who had been groomed for the role, it was as someone who had earned every inch of it. Crockett's rise was not just personal triumph, it was symbolic. She embodied the communities that had been ignored for too long. She carried with her the voices of immigrants, working families, women, and people of color who had been told again and again that they did not belong in those rooms. Every speech she gave, every vote she cast, every stand she took was infused with that responsibility. She was not polished in the way traditional power expected. She did not hide her fire behind careful phrases. She spoke plainly, directly, with a sharpness that came from living the struggles she described. Critics called her too blunt. Supporters called her authentic. To her, it wasn't strategy, it was survival. And yet, beneath the sharp edges was something deeper. Dignity. Crockett carried herself with a sense of purpose that was impossible to shake. She did not posture or pretend. She represented. She remembered the faces of her community every time she stepped to a microphone. She remembered the children who looked up at her and saw someone who looked like them. She remembered the elders who told her that she was proof their sacrifices had meant something. These were the lessons that shaped her. The hardship of being underestimated. The struggle of breaking into systems designed to keep her out. The persistence of holding on to dignity when others tried to strip it away. They were not just chapters in her story. They were the foundation of her strength. And those lessons forged in hardship were about to collide with Pompeo's arrogance. The air was thick with tension as Pompeo finished his attack, his words hanging like smoke in the room. He leaned back, satisfied, convinced that he had cornered Jasmine Crockett. To his allies, it seemed like the knockout punch had landed. They waited for her to stumble, to fumble through a defense, to confirm every doubt they had about her ability, to stand against someone of his stature. But Crockett did not stumble. She sat with the same composure she had carried from the beginning, her eyes fixed on Pompeo with a steady calm. The contrast was striking. On one side, a man who wielded arrogance like a weapon, raising his voice, gesturing wildly, forcing the spotlight onto himself. On the other side, a woman who remained still, her power drawn not from volume but from the quiet certainty that she was not afraid. Pompeo pressed again, sensing the silence as opportunity. He repeated his attack, amplifying the insults, painting her record as flimsy, her experience as irrelevant, her presence in Congress as a mistake. His tone grew sharper, each word dipped in disdain. He wanted to break her, to provoke a reaction, to make her lose her footing in front of the cameras. The audience shifted uneasily, sensing that the tension was about to snap. Every camera lens stayed fixed, ready to capture the moment Pompeo believed would define the night. Commentators watching from afar scribbled notes, preparing to write their headlines. For them, the story seemed clear. A political heavyweight dominating a newcomer, and yet Crockett's silence was not weakness. It was strategy. She let him talk, let him dig deeper into his own arrogance, let him believe he had the upper hand. Her stillness wasn't surrender. It was patience. She was allowing the moment to swell, allowing Pompeo to build his tower of certainty so that when she finally spoke, his tower would collapse with a single push. Those watching closely began to notice the shift. The more Pompeo ranted, the more his words began to feel hollow. His anger was unmasking him. His arrogance was no longer intimidating. It was overbearing. And next to him, Crockett's calm presence began to glow brighter, as if the contrast itself was a quiet form of resistance. Pompeo finished another tirade, his voice echoing in the silence that followed. He leaned forward, waiting, almost daring her to respond. This was the moment he believed she would finally crack. But instead of breaking, Jasmine Crockett raised her head, her eyes steady, her lips parting as if the silence itself had been waiting for her to fill it. Everyone in the room seemed to hold their breath. The audience leaned in. Even Pompeo, for all his bravado, froze in that split second. Because when she finally spoke, the balance of power would shift, and nothing in that room would ever feel the same again. Jasmine Crockett finally spoke, and the room changed instantly. Her voice was not loud, not hurried, but clear. The kind of clarity that cuts deeper than shouting ever could. She began with a pause, letting the silence weigh heavy, making every ear lean closer. Pompeo had filled the air with noise. She chose to fill it with precision. "Mr. Pompeo," she said, her tone steady. "You've spent a lot of time tonight talking about me, but very little time talking about the truth." The words landed like a spark on dry kindling. The audience shifted forward, eyes darting between her and Pompeo. He smirked, pretending to brush it off, but there was a flicker, a tiny flash of unease in his eyes. She had not only spoken, she had framed his entire attack as hollow. Crockett leaned in slightly, her voice measured, every syllable deliberate. She began dismantling his argument piece by piece. Where he exaggerated, she countered with fact. Where he insulted, she countered with context. Where he tried to paint her as inexperienced, she reminded him of the lived battles she had fought, the communities she had defended, the sacrifices that gave her presence in Congress meaning far beyond his sound bites. "Experience," she said, her voice rising just enough to command attention, "is not about how many years you've sat in a chair of power. It's about what you've done for the people you claim to represent. And on that measure, my record stands taller than your shadow." The audience erupted with gasps and murmurs. Phones recording the moment caught faces turning, eyes widening, jaws tightening. Pompeo shifted in his seat, trying to mask his discomfort with a dismissive shake of the head. But the camera caught it. The mask was cracking. Crockett didn't stop there. She drew on her own story, weaving the narrative of where she came from, the people who raised her, the struggles she endured. She spoke of families ignored by leaders like Pompeo, of communities dismissed as statistics, of voices that had been shut out of the conversation for too long. "When you dismiss me," she said, locking eyes with him, "you don't just dismiss Jasmine Crockett. You dismiss every working family who fought to put food on the table. You dismiss every immigrant who came here with hope and resilience. You dismiss every woman who has been told she doesn't belong. You dismiss them, not me." The crowd stirred again, louder this time, as if her words had unlocked something unspoken in the room. Even those who came expecting a lopsided fight began to sense the tide turning. Pompeo tried to interject, raising his hand slightly, but Crockett cut through the attempt without breaking stride. Her voice carried over him, firm and unshaken. You can try to bury me in insults, but let me remind you of something. Insults aren't facts. Arrogance isn't strength. And belittling others doesn't build your legacy. It destroys it. The words struck hard, like a gavel slamming down. For the first time, Pompeo's grin faltered. The silence between them was no longer his weapon. It was hers. Crockett let the pause linger, allowing the cameras to capture the image of Pompeo, sitting back, expression stiff while she remained poised and commanding. She wasn't rushing, she didn't need to. The more deliberate her pace, the more powerful her words became. She leaned forward slightly as though speaking directly to him, but her words were aimed far beyond the room. Power is not about how loudly you can shout down your opponent. It's about how deeply you can stand in your truth, and my truth doesn't tremble in the face of yours. The line hit like thunder. Gasps turned into applause that swelled and then broke into cheers, not just from her supporters but from those who simply recognized the weight of the moment. Phones lit up, capturing what would become the clip replayed again and again. The instant replay of the night Pompeo was stunned into silence, and silence it was. Pompeo sat there, lips pressed tightly, eyes darting. He had prepared for a fight with someone fragile, someone easy to crush. Instead, he was facing a wall of calm resolve that made his bluster look small. His usual weapons, volume, disdain, intimidation, had no power here. Crockett had disarmed him with nothing more than composure and truth. But Crockett wasn't finished. She raised her voice just enough to carry over the fading cheers, delivering the final blow with precision. You thought you were writing my ending tonight. What you didn't realize is that you were only writing your own. The room erupted. The applause was thunderous, rising higher than anything that had come before. Cameras shook in the crowd, as people stood, clapping, cheering, some even chanting her name. The sound swallowed the space, leaving Pompeo small, almost invisible, in the roar of approval. And then, just as suddenly, Crockett sat back in her chair, her face composed, her expression calm. She had delivered her counterattack not with fury, but with dignity. The kind of dignity that silences arrogance. The kind of dignity that resonates beyond a single night. Pompeo said nothing. For the first time in his career, perhaps, he found himself without words. And in that silence, Jasmine Crockett's victory was complete. What no one yet realized was that this moment would not end in that room. It was already leaking into the world outside, spilling onto screens, spreading through social media, echoing into conversations that Pompeo could no longer control. The shockwaves were only beginning. The debate might have ended that night, but the moment was only just beginning to live. What happened in that room, Jasmine Crockett standing firm, dismantling Pompeo's attack and leaving him speechless, did not stay confined to the four walls where it unfolded. It spilled out like wildfire. Within minutes, clips of her takedown began circulating across Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. The first uploads were shaky phone videos from audience members who had captured the exchange. In the grainy footage, you could hear the gasp from the crowd, the awkward silence from Pompeo, and the wave of applause that followed Crockett's final line. Those videos spread with stunning speed, racking up tens of thousands of views before the debate had even officially ended. By midnight, hashtags like #Crockett vs Pompeo, #Silenced by Truth, and Jasmine McDrop were trending nationally. Influencers clipped her speech into bite-sized reels overlaying bold captions. This is how you handle arrogance. News outlets, hungry for a viral story, rushed to publish headlines. Some framed it as a shocking upset. Pompeo left speechless after Crockett's stunning reply. Others leaned into the drama, the moment that shook the debate stage. But it wasn't just online buzz. The impact rippled into politics itself. Commentators on late-night television replayed the moment, pausing, rewinding, analyzing every beat of Crockett's delivery. One pundit remarked, "That wasn't just a counterpunch, that was the reshaping of power dynamics in real time." Another noted, Pompeo's silence said more than any of his words that night. For Pompeo, the fallout was immediate and bruising. Critics who had long accused him of arrogance seized on the clip as proof. Memes flooded the internet. One side-by-side image showed him mid-attack, pointing aggressively, and then sitting stone-faced as Crockett delivered her reply, with the caption, "How it started versus how it ended." Even some of his allies quietly admitted that he had walked straight into a trap he didn't see coming. For Crockett, the moment became a turning point. Supporters called her performance fearless, authentic, and unapologetic. Donations to her campaign spiked in the days that followed, with small dollar contributions pouring in from across the country. People who had never heard her name before now shared her story, inspired by the sight of someone standing tall in the face of political intimidation. Journalists dug deeper into her background, amplifying her rise from working-class roots to Congress. Profiles painted her not just as a politician but as a symbol, a voice for those often ignored in the corridors of power. Op-eds began circulating with titles like, "The Future Sounds Like Jasmine Crockett" and "Why Crockett's Stand Against Pompeo Resonates with America." Meanwhile, Pompeo tried to recover. His team released carefully worded statements, attempting to frame the debate as spirited disagreement, but the damage was already done. The clip of him sitting in silence, his smirk evaporated, his confidence deflated, had burned itself into the public's mind. No spin could erase the image. The ripple effect stretched even further. Community groups invited Crockett to speak. Grassroots movements cited her as proof that authenticity could outshine establishment power. On college campuses, her words were replayed in classrooms discussing rhetoric, resilience, and leadership. And in living rooms across the country, ordinary people who usually tuned out political debates found themselves replaying her takedown again and again, nodding in agreement, sharing it with friends. Because this wasn't just about politics. It was about something deeper. The universal satisfaction of watching arrogance collapse under the weight of truth. People recognized themselves in her story. The underestimated worker, the dismissed woman, the voice ignored until it could no longer be silenced. Watching her win that night felt like watching every underestimated person win a little piece of justice. And Pompeo? His silence that night became his new legacy. For years, he had built a persona of toughness, of unshakable authority. But in the end, all it took was one voice, calm, relentless, unafraid, to unravel it in front of the world. The shockwaves continued long after the applause faded. Crockett's words were replayed in campaign ads, in highlight reels, in motivational speeches. They became a rallying cry. And the debate itself, once expected to be routine, would forever be remembered for one defining exchange. In the end, it wasn't just a clash of two politicians. It was a story about power, arrogance, truth, and resilience. It was the night Mike Pompeo underestimated Jasmine Crockett, and the night Jasmine Crockett proved that silence can sometimes be the loudest victory of all. History often remembers debates for the policies exchanged, the statistics rattled off, the rehearsed talking points. But this moment, Jasmine Crockett facing Mike Pompeo, will not be remembered for any of that. It will be remembered for something deeper. The triumph of dignity over arrogance, of resilience over intimidation, of truth over bluster. Because at its heart, this wasn't simply about one exchange on a stage. It was about what that exchange represented. For years, Pompeo had embodied the swagger of entrenched power, the belief that credentials, titles, and an aura of authority could silence those who dared to challenge him. His career had been built on commanding the room, projecting dominance, and making others feel small. He thought that night would be no different. But Crockett's reply exposed a fault line in that belief. It reminded people that power without humility is fragile, that arrogance, when confronted with unshakable truth, crumbles faster than anyone expects. Her voice, steady and unapologetic, cut through years of political theater and left behind something rare, authenticity. And in that authenticity, millions found themselves reflected. Immigrants who had been told they didn't belong. Women who had been silenced in boardrooms or dismissed in classrooms. Working-class families who had been overlooked by politicians promising them everything, but delivering nothing. In Crockett's refusal to bend, they saw the dignity of their own struggles honored. What Pompeo underestimated most was not her debating skill, nor her command of facts. It was her lived experience. Every barrier she had faced, every door that had been closed, every dismissal she had endured, those became her weapons. They forged the steel in her voice. They shaped the conviction that allowed her to stand against a man who had spent his life wielding power like a weapon. And perhaps that's why the moment resonated so strongly. It wasn't just political theater. It was moral theater. It was a living parable, showing that truth spoken with courage can silence even the loudest arrogance. That the measure of leadership is not how forcefully you attack, but how steadfastly you stand. In the days and weeks after, as the clips continued to circulate, the lesson grew clearer. People weren't just watching Crockett versus Pompeo. They were watching the eternal struggle play out. The clash between pride and humility, fear and courage, cruelty and dignity. And in this chapter of that struggle, dignity won. For the audience at home, the takeaway was undeniable. Titles fade, power shifts, but what endures is character. What lasts is truth. And in the silence that followed Crockett's words, the entire country was reminded of the power of a single voice unwilling to bow. So the moral wasn't just about politics. It was about life. About every moment when someone tries to belittle you, intimidate you, or dismiss your worth. About how even in those moments, your story, your truth, your dignity are stronger than the arrogance standing in front of you. Because sometimes the greatest victory isn't the applause you receive. It's the silence you create when arrogance has nothing left to say. And that silence on that night belonged not to Mike Pompeo. It belonged to Jasmine Crockett, and it belonged to everyone who saw themselves in her courage. But as the applause faded, and as the hashtags trended, a larger question began to emerge. A question that would define not just Crockett's legacy, but the future of American politics itself. What happens when dignity finally takes the microphone? That night will be replayed for years to come, not as a footnote in a political debate, but as a moment that reminded America what true strength looks like. Mike Pompeo's attack was meant to diminish Jasmine Crockett, but instead, it amplified, her voice louder than ever before. And in doing so, it sent a message far beyond one stage, one room, one audience. Because what we saw was more than politics. We saw dignity under fire. We saw courage sharpened by struggle. We saw a reminder that no amount of arrogance, no wall of titles or power, can stand against truth spoken with conviction. That is why this moment matters. That is why it will be remembered. And yet this story doesn't end here. Because the fight for dignity, equality, and justice doesn't happen only on debate stages. It happens every day. In our workplaces, in our schools, in our homes. It happens whenever someone is told they don't belong, and they answer by standing tall. It happens whenever arrogance tries to silence truth, and truth refuses to bow. So, the question is not just what Jasmine Crockett said to Mike Pompeo that night. The question is, what will we do with that inspiration? Will we carry it forward? Will we share it, spread it, let it remind others that resilience is stronger than intimidation? If this story moved you, if it made you proud, if it reminded you of your own strength, then don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Talk about it. Let it live beyond this video. Because every voice raised in truth, every person who refuses to bow, brings us one step closer to a country where dignity always wins. Subscribe, stay with us, be part of this movement. Because the story isn't over, it's only just beginning.